Welcome everyone to our post-graduation work permit information session for international students at SFU. My name is Karen Lockyer and I am an international student advisor and immigration specialist here at SFU. I'm also pleased to be joined today by my colleague Aska. Aska is also an international student advisor and immigration specialist at SFU and has kindly offered to moderate our discussion today. Given the current context here in Canada, it is more important than ever to acknowledge the land that we are all on. As visitors on this land, we have an important responsibility to acknowledge the unceded grounds on which we are all privileged to gather together in the pursuit of higher education. Therefore, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kikite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples, on whose traditional territories our 3 SFU campuses reside. Here you will see a brief outline of the topics that we'll go through today in our presentation. I will begin with a short introduction of the International Services for Students, or ISS office, where we have the privilege of working to support SFU students from international pathways. I will then move on to speak to the enrollment requirements for international students. As immigration requirements and policy often interact with one another, I feel it's important to outline the enrollment requirements, particularly as it pertains to study permits, work eligibility, and post-graduation work permit eligibility. After reviewing this, we will arrive at the post-graduation work permit eligibility criteria and application process. During that time, we'll discuss work eligibility during the transition to the post-grad work permit and highlight several COVID-19 related policy impacts which may come into play as you prepare for your post-grad work permit application. And then we'll take the rest of our time today to address your questions. Due to the evolving nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have witnessed many changes taking place very, very rapidly. Thus, some of the information I will be sharing with you today might change. The information we share today is current to the best of our knowledge as of today's date, which for those of you watching the recording is November the 28th, 2022. At ISS, or International Services for Students, we offer a wide range of services to help support your time at SFU as an international student. And you can see a list of the services and supports that we offer to SFU students on this slide. As international student advisors, we provide non-academic advising, or advising and information about your temporary immigration status in Canada, and this includes your study permit, work eligibility, post-grad work permit, and other such topics. And in addition, our team offers advice on medical insurance and how to navigate the Canadian healthcare system. As you'll see here, there are various options for you to connect with an international student advisor on all 3 SFU campuses and virtually or globally. This includes both in-person and virtual booked and dropped-in appointments, live chat, email, and phone. We understand that this continues to be a difficult time for many and that students may have different comfort levels and abilities with accessing in-person services like advising. We're here for you and we want you to feel safe and comfortable. We will continue to offer both virtual and in-person services so that we can best support you. I'll also mention our website, as that's a great resource that includes our instruction guides, for example, on how to apply for immigration documents like the post-grad work permit, and also has lots of information about medical insurance, enrollment requirements for international students, work eligibility, and a lot more. We always recommend our website and our self-guided resources as a first step in getting your questions answered. So that's us and what we do in a nutshell. We're going to move along now to look at the enrollment requirements for international students. As immigration rules and policies do not exist in a vacuum, and because these policies often interact and overlap with one another, let's first look at the enrollment requirements for international students and the work eligibility requirements for students at SFU, which includes the most common types of work that our students engage in, being on-campus work, off-campus work, and work that's an essential part of your study program, or co-op work. Your enrollment at SFU affects your ability to work, study, and stay in Canada after completing your studies. Your study permit has conditions attached to it, which you need to comply with during your stay in Canada. You are also required to meet a set of eligibility criteria in order to work while you study. And then, if you are planning to apply for a post-graduation work permit after you finish your studies, you must additionally meet the eligibility criteria under the post-graduation work permit program. So to begin with study, as an international student holding a study permit, you are required to actively pursue studies. According to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, this means that you must remain enrolled and make reasonable, timely progress towards completing your program. To be considered actively pursuing studies as required by IRCC, you may be enrolled in a full-time or occasionally a part-time course load. If you would like to review the full-time definition at SFU for immigration purposes, you can find this on our website, and I've also linked it on this slide for you. While you may have academic or program-specific criteria which require you to study on a full-time basis, you are not required to study full-time each term to comply with your study permit conditions. If students need to take time away from their studies, IRCC states that any leave taken from a program of study should not exceed 150 days, and the leave must be authorized by the school, in this case, SFU. With all this being said, as we will see shortly, your enrollment can impact your ability to work in Canada and your eligibility to apply for a post-graduation work permit. As you'll see here, there are different types of work you might pursue while you are a student at SFU. You may work on the SFU campus, you might work off campus, and you may also work in an SFU approved co-op, internship, or practicum while you're with us. The requirements for each are different, and as you will see here, your enrollment impacts your ability to work on and off campus under your study permit. Students are required to study full-time in the term they wish to work and meet IRCC's work eligibility criteria, as outlined on this slide, in order to work on and off campus under their study permit. Off-campus work is restricted to up to 20 hours per week during regular academic terms. However, eligible students may work full-time during a regularly scheduled break during their studies. The designated regularly scheduled breaks at SFU are different for undergraduate and graduate students. For undergraduate students, the reading week, breaks between terms, and the summer term may be considered regularly scheduled breaks for immigration purposes. For graduate students, the reading week, the breaks between the terms, are considered regularly scheduled breaks for immigration purposes. And some programs may also have what's called an academic break in the curriculum, which may also be considered a regularly scheduled break. In order to be eligible to work full-time during a regularly scheduled break, students must hold full-time enrollment in the academic term prior to and following the break, in addition to meeting the IRCC requirements. If students are pursuing a SFU required and approved co-op, internship, or practicum, then this is a different type of work that typically would be performed under a co-op work permit. Note that for all of these types of work, on campus, off campus, co-op, and post-graduation, you must also hold a valid social insurance number or SIN number. I also wanted to mention that undergraduate and graduate students that are enrolled in a full-time cooperative education placement, approved internship, or practicum, as per their program requirements, are considered to be studying full-time for immigration purposes in the term or terms during which they are pursuing that co-op. IRCC recently introduced a temporary measure which will allow eligible international students to work more than 20 hours per week from November the 15th, 2022 to December the 31st, 2023. Eligible students whose study permit application or study permit extension application was received by IRCC on or before October the 7th of 2022 will benefit from this measure. Each student's eligibility under this measure may differ based on their circumstances, including when IRCC received their study permit or study permit extension application, and whether they meet the requirements to work off campus. We recommend that you carefully review the information available on the IRCC website, our website, and reach out to an international student advisor if you have questions about your particular case. On that note, I would like to encourage you all to attend the upcoming virtual Immigration Updates Q&A session taking place on December the 1st from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time. During this session, my colleague Aska will go into further detail about important updated measures in place, including the temporary lift of the limit of off-campus work for eligible students. So it'll be a really informative session for you to attend. Moving back to the post-graduation work permit. The post-graduation work permit program is another area where we see student enrollment impacting their eligibility to work. Under the post-grad work permit program, students are required to maintain full-time student status during each academic term of their studies. For SFU undergraduate students, full-time enrollment or study in the spring and fall terms is a requirement, as these are considered formal academic terms for immigration purposes. The summer term is optional in terms of enrollment and may be a regularly scheduled break, as we mentioned earlier. This means that SFU undergraduate students may enroll part-time or take the term off in the summer without negatively impacting their eligibility for a post-graduation work permit. For graduate students, full-time enrollment in the spring, summer, and fall terms is required in order to maintain eligibility for the post-grad work permit. IRCC notes that possible exceptions to the full-time requirement may be made during a period of authorized leave from study and during a student's final term of study. Current global situations continue to create unique challenges for many students. For many reasons, some students have had to drop to part-time study or take time off from their studies. As we talked about earlier, under the postgrad work permit program, students are required to maintain full-time student status during each semester of their studies. The IRCC program delivery instructions indicate that students who have taken a period of leave at any time during their studies must include documentation proving the leave was authorized by their school in their postgrad work permit application. The documentation to provide will differ based on whether you're a graduate student or an undergraduate student. We recommend that you review our post-graduation work permit instruction guides for more information and get in touch with us if you have any questions about this. I do understand from the advanced questions and also from my advising sessions that several or many students are concerned about how postgrad work permit eligibility will be impacted if they've taken a formal academic term off or if they've studied part-time in one of those terms. If you're in a situation where you've had previous study terms during which you were not able to study full-time, what we recommend is that you contact us directly for case-specific advice on how to address time off from study or periods of part-time study within the context of a postgrad work permit application. Each student case is unique, and we will be happy to work with you and guide you further on how to best approach your application if you're in this kind of situation. As mentioned here, in addition to maintaining full-time study for the duration of the program, students must also meet all other postgrad work permit eligibility criteria. So we're going to move along now to look a bit closer at the post-graduation work permit and discuss the application process. Full-time international students may be eligible to apply for a postgrad work permit upon completion of their studies in Canada. This work permit is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, meaning that you can only be issued a postgrad work permit once. So this is important to think about if you plan to complete multiple credentials in Canada. The postgrad work permit is an open work permit of up to 3 years in length, and you do not need a job offer or work experience to apply. In our advanced questions, many students asked, when is the best time to apply for a postgrad work permit? And this may depend on your own specific circumstances. IRCC does state that students must apply for the postgrad work permit within 180 days of completing their program of study. It is important to note here that the date of your convocation or graduation ceremony has no relation to the 180-day application period for your postgrad work permit. And we'll talk a bit more about this 180-day timeline a bit later. To be eligible for a postgrad work permit, you must complete a study program at a designated learning institution like SFU that was at least 8 months long and that led to a degree, diploma, or certificate. As we talked about earlier, you must have also maintained full-time status as a student during each semester of your program, with those possible exceptions being made during a period of authorized leave or in a student's final term. And to recap, for SFU undergraduate students, full-time study in the spring and fall terms is required. And for SFU graduate students, full-time study in the spring, summer, and fall terms is required. We would encourage that you do review the full eligibility criteria for the postgrad work permit program by visiting the IRCC website. So the next question is, how can I apply? Well, in most cases, you must apply online for a postgrad work permit, and this can be done on the IRCC website. If you are here in Canada, you can submit your postgrad work permit application in Canada. You may also apply for a postgrad work permit from outside of Canada. The postgrad work permit application costs $255. If biometrics are required, this will cost an additional $85. It's important to note that temporary residents who are in Canada and who would normally be required to provide biometrics are currently exempted from the requirement to provide biometrics. And we'll talk about this a bit later too. Processing times for a work permit application will vary depending on the visa office location. So example, whether you apply in Canada or outside Canada. And the processing times, estimated processing times, are always available on the IRCC website at the link appearing on this slide. Processing times fluctuate throughout the year, so it's a really good idea to bookmark the IRCC processing time website so that you can stay up to date on the most recent estimated processing. So here we've listed some basic requirements when it comes to a postgrad work permit application. Whether you apply for your work permit in Canada or outside of Canada, you will be required to include proof that you have completed your program of study in your application. From SFU, you will need an official letter confirming your program completion. And it's important to note here that SFU issues 2 letters to graduating students. The first being the credential completion letter, which becomes available to you via GoSFU, and which is your first official notification of program completion from SFU. So that's the first one. And then secondly, you will receive the Senate letter, which will be emailed to your SFU email address shortly thereafter. So both of these letters are sufficient for the purposes of a postgrad work permit application, and both confirm that you've completed your program requirements, but you only need to include one of them in your work permit application. And the second document that you will need from SFU is your final transcript with your final grades. You will also be required to complete an application form and include documents like a copy of your passport or travel document in your application. What you see here is not an exhaustive list of requirements, and you may want to include additional documents specific to your case in your postgrad work permit application. So as an example, if you are not able to maintain full-time study throughout your program, you may want to include an explanation letter that you've written and supporting documents which speaks to your reasons for not being able to study full-time in each term in your application. So that's just an example of somewhere where you might add documents that aren't necessarily being asked for to your application. For in-Canada postgrad work permit applications, I would recommend that you review our 2 postgrad work permit instruction guides on our website because they're very helpful as a starting point. And for outside Canada postgrad work permit applicants, you will likely notice some differences in requirements, both in regard to the required forms and the supporting documents. So we recommend that outside Canada applicants consult with the country-specific visa office instructions for the visa office responsible to confirm the requirements, because there may be differences depending on where you're applying from. A common question that students often ask during advising appointments is whether you can apply for a postgrad work permit on your own. And what I always say is that this is a matter of personal preference. Our team of international student advisors and immigration specialists are here to support you if you have questions or if you need help with your application. But you may also choose to work with an authorized representative, like an immigration consultant or an immigration lawyer, if this is your preference. So my suggestion would be to start by reaching out to us, and then we can guide you further and you can make your decision then. So with regard to when is the best time to apply for a postgrad work permit, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, this might be different for each student depending on your own unique circumstances and your plans after graduation. I will go through the IRCC rules that would be applicable here though, and important to take into consideration when you're trying to decide when to apply. So as we mentioned before, you can apply for the postgrad work permit from inside or outside of Canada, and in both cases, you must apply within 180 days of completing your program of study at SFU. Based on the IRCC instructions, we recommend you begin counting the 180-day period from either the day your thesis grade is made available in GoSFU, if your program includes a thesis, or the final grade deadline of your final term of study, if your program is a non-thesis program. Another important kind of timeline to keep in mind is that under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, your study permit will become invalid 90 days after you have completed your program of study, or on the expiry date printed on the permit, whichever comes first. It is important to be mindful of this if you will be applying for your work permit in Canada. Based on IRCC instructions, we recommend that you begin counting the 90-day period from the date you receive the first official notification of program completion from SFU. If you will be applying for a postgrad work permit from inside Canada, it's important that you hold valid immigration status at the time you submit your application. If you are in a situation where you're in Canada and your study permit will expire or become invalid before you can submit your postgrad work permit application, then you have a few options. If you're still within your final term of study, you can submit an application to extend your study permit within Canada for an additional period of time. This is often referred to as a bridging extension of your study permit. This should then give you sufficient time to finish your studies and obtain the necessary paperwork from SFU to apply for your work permit. If your study permit, on the other hand, is expiring after you finish your studies, but before you wish to apply for the postgrad work permit, you could consider applying to change your status to that of a visitor in order to remain in Canada longer. To do so, you would apply online for a visitor record before your study permit expires or becomes invalid. And like we talked about earlier, you can also, if you're not going to be in Canada, you can submit a postgrad work permit application from outside of Canada. If you are completing your studies from outside of Canada, you can apply for your work permit from wherever you're located, as long as you're eligible for the work permit and you've been approved for a study permit. So the next topic we'll move on to is the validity of the post-graduation work permit, which I know that students do often have questions about. It's important, first of all, to state that the postgrad work permit is issued based on the official length of the program of study completed to a maximum of 3 years. Study programs must be a minimum of 8 months in duration to be eligible. If you complete a program of study that is between 8 months and 2 years in duration, IRCC may issue a postgrad work permit that's valid for up to the same length as your study program. So as an example, if I complete a 1-year study program, then I may be eligible for a 1-year postgrad work permit. If the official length of the program of study is 2 years or more, a 3-year postgrad work permit may be issued. I do want to emphasize here, though, that IRCC does make the final determination with regard to the duration of postgrad work permit that is issued. So we, as international student advisors, are not able to confirm or guarantee the duration of postgrad work permit that you will receive. We can help to guide you, though, on important considerations based on IRCC policy. IRCC also has language in their program delivery instructions about programs of study with a duration of 16 to 23 months in relation to postgrad work permit validity, which I will share with you on the next slide. So you'll see here that from IRCC's program delivery instructions, they state, officers may issue a 3-year post-graduation work permit to individuals who complete a master's or doctoral degree in Canada when the eligible designated learning institution has confirmed in the written confirmation of program completion that the degree is 16 to 23 months in length and does not include regularly scheduled breaks. I like to specifically mention this during my postgrad work permit info sessions because I know we have several graduate programs of study here at SFU that may fall under this category given their duration. Again, I do want to state that IRCC visa officer processing the application will make the final determination with regard to eligibility and validity. So let's briefly then go through the timeline of events as they would normally happen with a postgrad work permit application. First of all, you complete your program of study. Then, like we spoke about, you would obtain that official notification from SFU that you've completed your studies, the credential completion letter or the Senate letter, and request your final transcript. You would then submit your post-graduation work permit application within 180 days of completing your program. If you apply in Canada, once your application is approved, your post-graduation work permit will be mailed to your Canadian address. And if you apply outside of Canada, you will receive a port of entry introduction letter or a work permit approval letter, which you will present upon re-entering Canada to obtain your post-grad work permit. I've also linked a really helpful section of our website to this slide. My colleague Sophia created this really wonderful post-grad work permit visual timeline that I think is helpful when you're making your plans and determining all those different timelines that you have to keep in mind with regards to your application. So that'll be linked there for you too when we send you the slides. One more important thing to note is that your social insurance number and your British Columbia Medical Services Plan, or MSP, coverage, they're both issued to expire with your study permit. So once you've obtained your post-grad work permit, you'll then need to renew your SIN and renew your BC MSP. So we'll move along now to discuss work eligibility during the transition to the post-grad work permit. The rules for working on and off campus are slightly different in a student's final term of study if they have maintained full-time student status during each formal academic term of their studies and have the appropriate conditions on their study permits. As we discussed earlier, generally students must be studying full-time in the term they wish to work in order to be eligible to work on and off campus. While this is true, students may not need a full course load to complete their program in their final term of study, and thus may be studying on a part-time basis in their final term. IRCC recognizes this, and if you meet the eligibility criteria, you may be permitted to work on and off campus in your final term, even if you're studying part-time. I have linked the appropriate IRCC rules to this slide so that you can review them if you're in that situation. It's important to note here, though, that if you are studying part-time in your last term and you were not a full-time student in your program in Canada up until your last term, then you would unfortunately not be permitted to work on campus or off campus in your final term of study. If you're not eligible to work in your final term of study, this could also impact your eligibility to work after submitting a post-grad work permit application. If you are eligible to work off campus under your study permit in your final term of study, then you can continue to work until you receive official notification of program completion from SFU. And this is the credential completion letter issued to you via Go SFU that we were talking about earlier. Once you receive official notification of program completion from SFU, you must stop working under your study permit as you no longer meet the requirements to work under your study permit. Once official notification of program completion is issued, you can then apply for the post-graduation work permit. And if you meet the eligibility criteria, which you see here on the right-hand side of my screen, then you can begin working full-time immediately after submitting your work permit application under R186W of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. From the advanced questions, I noticed that several of you are concerned about the processing times for post-grad work permits, and I definitely hear you. It is important to remember, though, that as long as you apply for your work permit while your status in Canada is still valid, you can stay legally in Canada under maintained status until IRCC makes a decision on your application. And that's true even if your status expires while you're waiting for that work permit application to process. Additionally, if you meet the requirements under R186W that we just discussed, then you can also start working full-time right away after you submit your post-grad work permit application. When you transition to the post-grad work permit, your spouse or common law partner may be eligible to apply for another type of open work permit if you are employed in a skilled occupation and you have a work permit that's valid for at least 6 months. So a skilled occupation would be one that falls within the National Occupational Classification, or NOC, category 0A or B. You must also physically reside in Canada or plan to physically reside in Canada while working. If your spouse or common law partner would like to apply for this open work permit, they would need to include both evidence of your relationship, so your marriage certificate or evidence of a common law relationship, and evidence of your skilled employment in their work permit application, in addition to all the other required forms and supporting documents. You and your spouse or common law partner are welcome to connect with us if you have any questions about this option and how to plan for this transition period to the post-grad work permit. We're almost at the end now. Thank you so much for your attention so far. We're almost at the questions. So given the impact of COVID-19 on international students, IRCC has announced temporary policy changes that I wanted to briefly touch on as we close out our session today. Under normal circumstances, all distance learning courses completed outside Canada are excluded from the time accumulated towards the length of a postgrad work permit, and 50% of a student's courses must be completed in Canada and in person. However, given the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, IRCC introduced some temporary changes to this requirement, and this has happened in 2 stages: the full facilitation measures and, most recently, the reduced facilitation measures. The full facilitation measures, which ended on August 31st, 2022, apply to students who were enrolled in a post-graduation work permit eligible program in March 2020, or who started a program of study between March 2020 and August 31st, 2022. These students are not required to complete 50% of their program or programs of study in Canada, and up to 100% of their program can be completed online from outside Canada. For this group of students, time spent studying outside Canada can be counted towards the overall length of the postgrad work permit until August 31st, 2023. Now, the reduced facilitation measures, which began on September the 1st of 2022, apply to students who began or will begin post-graduation work permit eligible programs between September 1st of 2022 and August 31st of 2023. This group of students are required to complete at least 50% of their program or programs of study in Canada. Time spent studying outside of Canada will be counted towards the overall length of the work permit only if it constitutes less than 50% of the total program. So I know that's a lot of dates and information, but I understand we have a mixture of students with us today. Some of you may be just starting your degree, some of you may be closer to completing. So I wanted just to kind of go through both those facilitation measures. If you're required to give biometrics as part of your postgrad work permit application, so this would mean that you have not given biometrics as part of an application to come to Canada in the last 10 years, then like I mentioned earlier, currently you would be exempt from the requirement to have to give biometrics if you're applying for your work permit in Canada. This is a temporary measure, so we do advise that you try to stay up to date on any changes to this measure by monitoring the Government of Canada website or by reaching out to us if you have questions as well. This temporary measure does not apply if you are outside Canada and submitting a postgrad work permit application from outside Canada, though. And finally, if you intend to work in an occupation that brings you into close contact with vulnerable populations, or where the protection of public health is essential and would normally require an immigration medical exam as part of your postgrad work permit application, you may be exempted from this requirement under a new temporary public policy introduced by IRCC. To benefit from this policy, you would need to meet a set of criteria, another set of criteria, which includes having completed an immigration medical exam on or after October the 6th, 2017, and applying in Canada for your work permit. If you're interested in reviewing the full criteria for this exemption in particular, they can be found on the IRCC website. And we also have a really helpful news and updates post on our website that goes through that as well. So we've reached the end of our formal presentation. Before we move on, I want to thank you all so much for your patience going through all this information. I feel like it was a lot to digest, and I appreciate you sticking around with us today. We're going to move on now to our question and answer section of the day, so I will end the recording in a moment. For those of you watching the recording, thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in a future workshop or in one-on-one advising.